Hello guys, so this video will be about efficiency and fairness of markets. So the central question around this chapter or around this theme is that should price gouging be illegal? Now economists love to talk about how competitive markets are great and how everyone reaches the equilibrium and everyone is happy at the equilibrium. But think about the case of coronavirus, right? This thing is happening right now, so we don't need to really imagine about it. We know what is happening. So people are stocking up on items such as toilet paper. So basically, the demand for these items have gone up because of this natural phenomenon. So should the price also rise because of that increased demand? So in other words, should the suppliers be able to price gouge? Now, according to the competitive markets or the law of demand and supply, I mean, price gouging, if competitive markets are working competitively without any sort of government intervention, that price gouging should be legal. But there's a moral sentiment attached to this question as well. So we have to take into account all of these things when we try to answer the question that should price gouging be illegal. So at the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe the alternative methods of allocating scarce resources. So think about the different methods that can be used to allocate scarce resources, like first come first served, like organizing a competition, like the lottery. All of these are different methods of allocating scarce resources. You should also be able to distinguish between value and price. So just think about the value is the satisfaction that you derive from consuming any good, and the price is what you pay for it. So if the value is higher than the price, then the consumer will be extracting a consumer surplus. You should also be able to distinguish between cost and price and define producer surplus. What that simply means is that for a producer, anything which is produced costs some amount of money. So if that amount of money is lower than the equilibrium price of that good or service, it would mean that the producer actually extracts a producer surplus. You should also be able to evaluate the efficiency of the alternative methods of allocating resources. So all the different methods of allocating resources that we describe in this chapter, not all of them are going to be efficient methods. So we'll have to kind of take a look at each method and decide if they are efficient methods or not. Then we will also be able to explain the main ideas about fairness and evaluate the fairness of alternative methods of allocating scarce resources. Now, in economics, there's always a discussion between efficiency and equity, and that is the discussion that we will go at the end of this chapter. Now, what are the different methods of allocating scarce resources? So, some of the methods that the basic method that we looked at in the previous chapters is market price, in which the demand and supply of the good actually allocates the resource, and we get to the equilibrium price, and that is the price that everyone pays to get the resource, the scarce resource. Now, listed below are some of the other methods which we will look at one by one. So market price, that's the first one, that's the most important one. So most of the goods, most of the scarce resource in the economy get allocated through the market price. For example, you sell your labor services in a market, and you buy most of what you consume in markets. So all of these markets rely on the price mechanism, meaning the mechanism through which we figure out what the demand is and what the supply is and how these are changing, and the market price will be at the point where the supply equals the demand. The quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, to be more specific. The second method of allocating resources is command. The classic example of the command method would be if you think about, if you take the example of communist Russia. So Russia was a communist country at one point before, like during the time of the Cold War, and all of the allocation of resource was done through the command system, meaning there was a central authority which basically determined who gets what, how resources are allocated amongst the producers and the consumers. So as far as the political systems goes, all of the previous political systems which relied on command economy or command system showed a lot of inefficiencies in their systems. But for example, if you are in a job and there is one central command authority, meaning your boss, and that boss is basically determines how resources are allocated within that workplace, now that can be a system which can work. So it depends on the context how all of these systems of resource allocation can work or will not work. Majority rule is another main method of allocating resources. Now think about politics, right? Think about how we take part in elections. So elections, the outcomes of elections are determined by majority rule. So different politicians have different agendas, they come up with different policies, and we choose through majority rule which politician should be governing us, and in a sense which policies should be implemented. Contest. Now think about if someone is allocating a resource of a car in a mall, but that is determined through a contest, right? So maybe there is some contest which you have to take part in, and the winner of the contest gets the car, which is the prize of taking part in the contest. So in that kind of an example, a contest is the way through which scarce resources are allocated. Example over here on the slide is the Oscars. Now a lot of different people are making movies, so they are essentially all competing for the same prize, but whoever makes the best movie according to the critics actually gets the prize. Now another method of resource allocation is first come first served. Now think about if you're going to a restaurant, sometimes you will have to wait in line to get a seat. So it's simply because the method of resource allocation which is being implemented is first come first served. Similarly, you go to Walmart and you're looking for an item, but that item is already sold out. It simply means that people who came before you actually got the item and you were late, and that's why you could not get whatever product you were looking for. So first come first served is another method of resource allocation. Sharing equally. Now if a resource is a public resource, for example a public park or a public library, now everyone can share that resource equally. So sharing equally is another method of resource allocation. But everyone must be in agreement if that is the case, if that is the method of resource allocation. People must be in agreement about how to use that common resource. And that becomes a real problem, especially when it comes to public goods and public services. And we will get into that in later chapters in this book. Now, lottery is another method of resource allocation. State lotteries and casinos reallocate millions of dollars worth of goods and services. The example on the slide is that tickets to Michael Jackson's memorial service were allocated by lottery. Another example that I can give you right now, which is also of a personal nature, is that I am basically enrolling my child into a daycare, and they said that you can basically apply, but then we will actually hold a lottery to determine who actually gets one of the limited spots available. So lottery is another method of scarce resource allocation. So another important question that we have to look at when we are looking at all of these methods of scarce resource allocation is that how many of them are actually efficient methods of resource allocation. So far we have looked at lottery, sharing equally, first come first served, contest, majority rule, command, and market price. So one thing that we can be sure of is that market price will always be an efficient way of resource allocation. Now all of these other methods like command, majority rule, contest, first come first served, sharing equally, lottery, and personal characteristics depend on the context. So it basically depends on the context whether each of them will be efficient methods or not. For example, first come first served, looking at the example of the supermarket or the example of searching for apartments, I think first come first served is a purely efficient way of resource allocation, but in some other context it might not really work. So the last one that, well, not the last one, the second last one I think that we will look at, the second last method of resource allocation that we will look at is personal characteristics. So personal characteristics allocate resources to those with the right characteristics. For example, some people like to date tall men or tall women, right? So there's a personal characteristics which people are actually using to determine the worth of the other individual. So we do that all the time, right? Sometimes like some people like to hang out with calmer individuals, some people like to hang out with funnier individuals, some people like to party, some people like to basically have a quiet time and watch TV. So all of these preferences lead to personal choices that are different when we are choosing people who we spend our time with. But when these sort of preferences and personal characteristics gets into public spheres and public spaces, that can be problematic. For example, there are a number of researchers which have looked at how personal characteristics are actually used to determine who gets the job. So then, I mean, when personal characteristics are used in those kind of situations, then it becomes a case of discrimination. So this can be a little problematic. Now, force is another way of allocating scarce resources. So wars, for example, so in throughout the course of history, wars have been an important way of allocating scarce resources. So countries would invade another country and then basically take over all of their scarce resources. So there was force was definitely a very important method of scarce resource allocation, which is not that common these days, but in previously those wars over scarce resources were much more common than today. Now, we have already gone over all of these methods of scarce resource allocation. So what we will look at now is allocation methods and efficiency. So what is allocative efficiency is the question that becomes central. So allocative efficiency is a situation in which the quantities of goods and services produced are those that people value most highly. So how do we differentiate between allocative efficiency and production efficiency? So if you go back to the example of PPF, which we covered in one of the earlier chapters, production efficiency happens at every single point on the boundary of the PPF. So any single point on the PPF shows production efficiency because at that point we are basically producing most efficiently. We are utilizing our scarce resource in the most efficient way possible. But not all of the points on the PPF will show allocative efficiency because there's only one point on the PPF where we are producing at the highest valued point. So we are basically producing the quantities which the society or the economy has deemed most valuable. So in short, the PPF can tell us what can be produced, but the PPF does not tell us about the value of what we produce. So not all points on the PPF are valued the same. Just think about that for a second, and then we will get to allocative efficiency in more detail. So the next important concept that we will go over is the concept of marginal benefit. Marginal benefit is the benefit that a person receives from consuming one more unit of a good or service. So people's preferences determine marginal benefit. So obviously preferences have a huge role in determining marginal benefits. Why is that the case? Is simply because people value different things differently. So for someone who really loves to eat ice cream, the marginal benefit of an additional ice cream might be higher than the person who actually prefers frozen yogurt over ice cream. So that is just one simple example to understand how marginal benefit of a good will be different for everybody. But marginal benefit also decreases as the quantity of the good that you have increases. So that is simply the principle of decreasing marginal benefit. Sticking to the example of ice cream, if you have one scoop of ice cream, the marginal benefit of the second scoop would be greater than if you had 3 scoops of ice cream and you're calculating the marginal benefit of the 4th scoop of ice cream. And simply define marginal benefit from a good is what people are willing to forego to get one more unit of the good. So also think in terms of opportunity cost, that if you already have 4 scoops of ice cream, you would be willing to give up less for the 5th scoop of ice cream. You would be willing to give up less in terms of other goods and services than if you had only 1 scoop of ice cream and you were calculating the marginal benefit for the 2nd scoop. So you will be willing to give up less goods of services, more goods of services for the 2nd scoop than you would for the 5th scoop. Now marginal benefit at every point for the quantity that is available to us can be shown on the graph as well. So on the y-axis we have the marginal benefit, and on the x-axis we have the quantity, thousands of pizzas per day. So we are actually going to use the example of pizzas. So possibility A and point A tell us that if we produce 2,000 pizzas a day, people are willing to give up 15 units of other goods and services to get one more pizza. Now on its own, this point basically does not mean much, but then we have to compare it to all the other points of quantities that can be possible in this space. So point B is another point from which we can so that we can compare points A and point B with each other. Point B tells us that if we produce 4,000 pizzas a day, people are willing to give up 10 units of other goods and services to get one more pizza. Now how does point A compare with point B? Now at point A we had 2,000 units of pizzas per day, and at point B we have higher number of pizzas per day, which simply means that when you have a higher number of pizzas per day already, you are willing to give up less amount of other goods and services in order to get an additional unit of the pizza. So that this definition holds true in the case of points A and B, because at point A you are willing to give up higher number of other goods and services to get one more unit of pizza, but at point B that number goes down because you already have a higher amount of pizza available. Now similarly, point C tells us that if we produce 6,000 pizzas a day, people are willing to give up 5 units of other goods and services, so that opportunity cost actually goes down. So you're willing to give up less of other goods and services for an additional unit of pizza at point C than at points B and C. So if you join points A, B, and C, we basically get the marginal benefit curve. So you can pretty much calculate the marginal benefit at every possible quantity of pizza that can be available at different times. In essence, you get, by joining all of these points, you get the marginal benefit curve. Now, what is the marginal cost? So, marginal benefit comes from the consumer side of things, because what you are doing is that you are basically looking at how much you would how much you would be willing to give up of other goods and services if you want to consume one more unit of a particular good. But marginal cost comes from the producer side of things, or the supplier side of things. Marginal cost is the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of a good or service and is measured by the slope of the PPF. Now, taking you back to the example of the PPF in one of the earlier lectures, so what is the PPF telling us? So remember that the opportunity cost changes along the PPF. That's what we found out when we were discussing the PPF, right? And why is the opportunity cost changing? Because let's think of the example of the economy can produce only books and computers, right? So if the economy wants to produce more computers, then the resources which are more perfectly suited for the production of books now have to be used for the production of computers. So, which means that you're not that some of the inefficient resources for producing computers will now be used for the production of computers. So, in other sense, the opportunity cost of producing computers actually increases as we keep on producing more computers. And that is simply the concept which will be shown by marginal cost as well. The marginal cost of producing a good increases as more of the good is produced. And the same logic applies here, because you're moving resources away from production of other goods and services, and those resources are less suited for the production of computers, for which the production is increasing. So marginal cost curve shows the amount of other goods and services that we must give up to produce one more pizza. So if you look at point A tells us that if we produce 2,000 pizzas a day, we must give up on the production of 5 units of other goods and services. Point B tells us that if we produce 4,000 pizzas a day, we must give up 10 units of other goods and services. So how does point A and point B compare? Now, obviously at point B, you have to give up more units of other goods and services to produce one more unit of pizza, and the same logic applies. Some of the resources which are used now at point B to produce pizzas are actually less suited for the production of pizzas, and that is why the opportunity cost is actually increasing. Similarly, point C, the production of pizzas has gone up to 6,000, which means that the opportunity cost has also gone up to 15 units of other goods and services. Now, if we join points A, B, and C, we will actually get the marginal cost curve. Now, the marginal cost curve is an upward sloping curve, and the marginal benefit curve that we looked at previously is a downward sloping curve. So both of these should give you an idea of how they actually relate to the supply and demand of goods and services. The demand curve is a downward sloping curve, comes from the consumer side of things. The marginal benefit curve is also a downward sloping curve, also comes from the consumer side of things. Marginal cost curve is an upward sloping curve, comes from the producer side of things, and supply curve is also an upward sloping curve, also comes from the producer side of things. Now, how do we get to an efficient allocation? Efficient allocation is the highest valued allocation, which means that, first of all, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, but also that is the highest valued allocation, as in that level of allocation of scarce resources is the most valued by the society. So that is, the allocation is efficient if it is not possible to produce more of any good without producing less of something else that is valued more highly. So in a sense, we are comparing marginal benefit and marginal cost. So like I said before, production efficiency occurs at all the points on the PPF which is shown on this slide, but allocative efficiency will only occur at one single point. So let's suppose that the point which is shown by the red dot on this PPF is that point. So at that point, what will happen is that how do we get to that point? How do we know what point is the allocative efficiency point? So at that point, the marginal benefit will be equal to the marginal cost. How do we show that on the graph? So that will be the point where the marginal benefit curve intersects the marginal cost curve. So remember, just to remind you guys and just to bring home the point, allocative efficiency occurs at only one point on the PPF, while production efficiency occurs at all points on the PPF. Now, in this example, the allocative efficiency is occurring at a quantity of 4,000 pizzas per day. Now, if we look at the point where 2,000 pizzas are produced, now at that point the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, so the efficient quantity is larger, which means that too few pizzas are being produced, and then we'll have to basically move to 4,000 units of pizzas per day to actually get to the allocative efficiency point. Now the opposite end of this is that if we are at 6,000 pizzas of we are at the production of 6,000 pizzas per day. Now at this point the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit, which means that the efficient quantity is smaller, so we'll have to cut down on the production and get to 4,000 units of pizzas per day in order to get to the allocative efficiency point. Now, what is the similarity between demand and marginal benefit? Like I already pointed out, both demand and marginal benefit are basically negatively sloped, and both come from the consumer side of things. So buyers distinguish between value and price. As I pointed out in the very first slide, value is what the buyer receives in terms of the worth of the product, in terms of the satisfaction when the buyer actually uses that product, and price is what the buyer actually pays for that product. So the value of one more unit of a good or service is its marginal benefit. So that is the marginal benefit that we are actually calculating in our minds when we are actually thinking of buying that second scoop of ice cream. And marginal benefit can be measured as the maximum price that people are willing to pay for another unit of the good or service. So just keep this in mind, that if the value is greater than the price, if the satisfaction that you derive, if you put that in a monetary value, and if that is greater than the money, the price that you paid for that good or service, then it would mean that you are extracting a consumer surplus. A consumer will buy one more unit of a good or service if its price is less than or equal to the value the consumer places on it. That is pretty easy to understand. So what it all boils down to is that the demand curve is essentially a marginal benefit curve. So if you plot the marginal benefit curve, the demand curve will be the same as the marginal benefit curve. So both are showing the same thing. So demand curve is also negatively sloped, which simply means that if you have more of a particular good, you will be actually willing to give up more of other less of other goods and services in order to get one more additional unit of that good. For example, the demand curve for pizza tells us the dollar worth of other goods and services that people are willing to forego to consume one more pizza. So essentially shows the value the consumer places on each pizza, which is the same idea as the marginal benefit. So marginal benefit curve and the demand curve are showing the same thing, which means that essentially both of them are the same. Now this figure over here shows demand, the willingness to pay, and the marginal benefit. So essentially a demand curve will show three different things at the same time. So it will show the quantity demanded at each possible price. It will show the willingness to pay at each quantity demanded, and it will also show the marginal benefit, meaning how much you are willing to give up on the consumption of other goods and services. So this demand curve is showing the maximum price willingly paid for the last pizza available, essentially, right? So if the quantity of pizzas available is 10,000 pizzas per day, for that last unit, with the 10,000th unit, the maximum price which one of the consumers available in the economy is willing to pay is a price of $10. Consumer surplus. Now I've been talking about consumer surplus, that the value minus the price is the consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the marginal benefit from a good or service minus the price paid for it. So that is the formal definition of consumer surplus. Pretty much means the same thing, value minus the price, summed over the quantity consumed. So that is the important part. So we are basically adding up the surplus generated by each and every person who is taking part in the market of pizzas. So for example, the market price of a pizza is $10. So this market price is shown by this red line over here, right? So this is the market price. This is the downward sloping demand curve. So people buy 10,000 pizzas and spend $100,000 a day on pizzas, right? So at the equilibrium price, what you have is that quantity demanded is 10,000 pizzas per day, and 10,000 multiplied by the price 10 shows us this area over here, and that is the amount paid for all pizzas which are consumed in this market. But people are willing to pay $15 for the 5,000 pizza, so consumer surplus from that pizza is $5. So what I mean by that is that if the price was $15, 5,000 pizzas will be demanded. So that 5,000th pizza, at that point, someone is actually willing to pay a price of $15 for that particular last 5,000th unit of pizza, right? So for that, just take the example of that particular consumer. So that consumer is actually willing to pay $15 for that pizza, but the market price is only $10. So essentially, the value minus the price would be 15 minus 10, because that since that individual is willing to pay $15 for that pizza, it means that the value that that consumer derives from the consumption of that pizza is $15 in terms of dollars. But the price that he pays is only $10. So for that particular consumer, the value minus price, or the consumer surplus, becomes $5. Now think about this consumer over here. Now this consumer is willing to pay $20 for 1 unit of pizza. But essentially this guy pays only $10 because that is the market price. So what will be the consumer surplus for this particular individual? It will be 20, which is the value, minus the 10, which is the price, equals to $10 of consumer surplus. So if we add up the consumer surplus for all of the individuals along this demand curve, or this marginal benefit curve, up to the point where we get to the equilibrium price or the market price, we actually get the total consumer surplus in this market. So essentially we have to add up the consumer surplus generated by each and every person who is taking part in this market, who is buying in this market. Also, another key point that we'll go into later, but I just want to point out is that think about what is the consumer surplus at this last unit sold, the 10,000 unit sold. Now think about this. At this point, the value, the willingness to pay for that last unit sold is only $10, which is equal to the market price. So the value $10 minus the market price $10 is actually zero. So the consumer surplus generated by the last person who actually buys the 10,000th unit of pizza will be zero. So that is the point until which the consumers will be buying in this market, until they can actually extract a surplus of zero. So definitely a positive surplus is better, but consumers will keep on buying in this market until they get to the point where the value equals the price. Now, is there any point of buying at this point? So at this point, the value, the willingness to pay is actually lower than the market price. So which would mean that the consumer surplus would be actually a negative term, and that would be a clear indication that no one will actually buy in this region over here, because the market price that they will pay will be higher than the value generated by the purchase. Like I said, consumer surplus from the 10,000 unit of pizza that people buy. So actually, for all the 10,000 units of pizza that people buy is the area of the triangle. So this, if you are calculating or adding up the consumer surplus for each of the individual in the market, then you will have to take the area of this triangle to calculate the total consumer surplus generated in this market. So what is the area of this triangle? So 20 minus 10, that is our height, and then 10 is our base. So half multiplied by base multiplied by height. So half multiplied by 10 multiplied by 10 gives us a value of 50,000 US dollars. So that is the total consumer surplus generated in this market. Now we come to the supply side, and we'll see how supply and marginal cost are similar to each other's. So sellers distinguish between cost and price. Cost is what a seller must give up to produce a good, and price is what a seller receives when the good is sold. So think about this. What is the incentive for a producer to supply in the market? So as long as the market price is above the cost, it gives the producer a good incentive to supply in the market. That should be pretty easy to understand. And in that case, when the price, the market price, the equilibrium price is higher than the cost of producing the good, it would mean that the producer is actually extracting a producer surplus. So just like in the case of consumer surplus, value minus the price is the consumer surplus. In the case of producer surplus, it's kind of reversed. The price minus the cost is the producer surplus. So the seller will produce one more unit of a good or service if the price for which it can be sold exceeds or equals its marginal cost. That is once again a pretty simple idea to understand. As long as the price is higher than the cost, there will be a producer surplus generated, and there will be incentive to supply in the market. So this concept essentially shows the marginal cost of production. So essentially a supply curve is a marginal cost curve. For example, the supply curve of pizzas tells us the dollars worth of other goods and services that firms must forego to produce one more unit of pizza. So pretty much the supply curve of pizza shows the seller's cost of producing each unit of pizza. Now, this is an example of a supply curve, and we are still looking at the market for pizzas. So the quantity supplied at each price is shown by the supply curve, everything else remaining the same. So if you look at the price of 10, you will see that the quantity supplied at that price is actually 10,000 units of pizzas, and if the price is lower, obviously it gives less incentive to supply, so the quantity supplied would be lower. If the price is higher, it will give higher incentive and the quantity supplied would be higher. So the minimum price that firms must be offered to supply a given quantity of pizza is what is shown on this supply curve. So if you think about this, this is showing the willingness to supply for pizzas in this market. So the minimum supply price for the 10,000 pizza has to be $10 in this market in order for suppliers to take part in this market. So let's see how we can calculate the producer surplus given this information. So once again, producer surplus is simply the price, the market price minus the cost. Producer surplus is the price. The formal definition of producer surplus is that it is the price of a good minus the opportunity cost of producing it, summed over the quantity produced. So once again, we will be summing up the producer surplus generated by each supplier or each producer in this market. So this is the example of the market for pizza, and the upward sloping curve is the supply curve or the marginal cost curve, which are pretty much the same thing. So the market price is still $10 for pizza. So what do we have over here? So what we have is basically all of these points are basically showing the cost of production or the marginal cost of production of pizza for each specific producer which is taking part in this market. So if you think about this point, the marginal cost of producing the 5,000th unit of pizza is $6, right? So if I ask you, what is that producer who is producing that 5,000th unit of pizza, what is the producer surplus for this producer? You will say that it should be the price that he is receiving for that 5,000 unit of pizza, which is equal to the equilibrium price or the market price, which is $10 per unit, minus the opportunity cost or the cost of production or the marginal cost of producing pizzas for that 5,000th unit of pizza, and that is equal to $6. So 10 minus 6 would be the producer surplus generated by that last producer who is producing the 5,000th unit of pizza. That is equal to $4 of producer surplus. Now you can pretty much calculate the producer surplus for each and every producer in this market. So think about the producer who is over here. So at this point, the opportunity cost or the marginal cost or the cost of production of pizza is equal to $2, right? So if that producer is getting $10 as the market price for that unit of production, then 10 minus 2 would become the producer surplus generated by that first unit of pizza sold in the market, which is equal to 8. So similar to the point of similar to the concept of consumer surplus, the producer surplus for the last unit of pizza supplied in the market for pizza will be equal to 0, because at this point the cost of production of pizza is exactly equal to the market price, which is 10. So producer surplus from the 10,000 pizzas sold is 40,000 a day. the area of the blue triangle. So if we want to calculate the total producer surplus generated in this market, we basically need to calculate the area of this blue triangle. Why is that the case? Because essentially we are summing up all the producer surplus generated by all the suppliers in this market. So let's look at what the area will be. So 10 minus 2, 8 will be the height, 10 will be the base, so half multiplied by 8 multiplied by 10, and that gives us $60,000 as the producer surplus generated in this market. So the cost equals the total revenue of 10,000 minus the producer surplus of 40,000. Sorry, producer surplus will not be 60,000, it will be 40,000. So if you calculate the area of this blue triangle, it should come up to be equal to 40,000. But the total revenue which is generated by this supply is actually equal to 10 multiplied by 10, which is equal to $100,000. So $100,000 minus the producer surplus, which is $40,000 shown by the area of the blue triangle, gives us the total cost of producing 10,000 pizzas. And that can also be shown by this area over here, which is the red area of the trapezoid, showing the total cost of producing pizza. Now, are markets efficient? So what do we have in this graph? We have the market equilibrium, where the quantity supplied equals to the quantity demanded, and that is the intersection of the marginal cost and the marginal benefit curve. We have the marginal cost curve, which is upward sloping. We have the marginal benefit curve, which is downward sloping. And when marginal benefit and marginal cost equal to each other, the quantity produced is efficient. Consumer surplus is maximized at this point because all of the consumer surplus that can be extracted is pretty much extracted, and the producer surplus is also maximized. So all of the producer surplus which can be extracted is extracted when we are at this efficient, happy point where we get the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity, and the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Now, in a competitive market, the demand curve shows the marginal benefit, the supply curve shows the marginal cost. So at the point of equilibrium, marginal benefit equals marginal cost, and resource allocation is efficient. So the total surplus is maximized. We've already covered that, which means that consumer surplus is maximized, and also the producer surplus is maximized. And why is that happening? How can the market get us to a point where both the consumer and the producer surplus are maximized? So it's simply, so no one is forcing anyone to act in this market, but buyers and sellers are actually just pursuing their self-interest, and as an outcome of pursuit of that self-interest, the social interest is also served. Going back to the example of the invisible hand, which was talked about by Adam Smith in the famous book Wealth of Nations. So he was of the opinion that when we are acting in our own self-interest in the markets, we actually get to the social interest. But sometimes that social interest does not result as an outcome of the pursuit of self-interest, and when that happens, a market failure happens. So markets sometimes fail, and that is not the ideal scenario because like I said before, as economists we love to talk about how great competitive markets are, how beautiful they are, that everyone is happy, we are at the equilibrium, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, but sometimes that is not the case because inefficiencies can occur and the market can either underproduce or overproduce. What is underproduction? Underproduction is when a firm cuts production to less than the efficient quantity. And whenever, just keep in mind that whenever underproduction or overproduction happens, a deadweight loss happens. A deadweight loss occurs. So it will be easier to see that deadweight loss on the graph, which we will do in the next couple of slides. How do we define deadweight loss? Deadweight loss is the decrease in total surplus that results from an inefficient underproduction or overproduction. Essentially means that there is a loss of surplus to the society. So it is a social loss. So this figure over here shows the effect of underproduction. So efficient quantity of production is 10,000 units of pizzas, where everyone would be happy. The quantity supplied would be equal to the quantity demanded. But if production is reduced to 5,000 units of pizza, the total surplus will be reduced. Why will it be reduced? Because this part of the blue triangle, which would have been part of the consumer surplus if we were at this point, is now gone to deadweight loss, meaning this is a loss of surplus to the society. Similarly, this triangle over here, the lower part of the blue triangle, would have been part of the producer surplus if we were at this point, but right now we are at this point, which means that this is a loss from the producer surplus and also a loss from the total surplus. So underproduction is inefficient and the total surplus is reduced by the amount of the deadweight loss, which is shown. So the total deadweight loss is actually shown by the area of this triangle. And this can be calculated if you have the numbers. Overproduction. Overproduction is when the government pays producers a subsidy, the quantity produced exceeds the efficient quantity. So once again, a deadweight loss will happen. So similar to the idea of underproduction, if we are overproducing, if we are producing 15,000 units of pizza instead of the efficient 10,000 units of pizza, you will see over here that this portion over here, which would have been part of the consumer surplus, is now a loss to the total surplus, and this portion, which would have been part of the producer surplus, is now actually a dead weight loss. So why is this dead weight loss happening? It's happening because the marginal cost is not equal to the marginal benefit. The marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit at the production of 15,000 units of pizza. So essentially, this total surplus generated in the market minus the deadweight loss because of overproduction will give you the resulting surplus in the market at the point of overproduction. Now, why does overproduction or underproduction happen? It happens because of market failure. Why do market failures happen? So following is the list of things which can actually cause market failures: price and quantity regulations, taxes and subsidies, externalities, public goods and common resources, monopoly, and high transaction costs. Now we'll take a look at each of these one by one. What are price and quantity regulations? So price regulations sometimes put a block on the price adjustments and lead to underproduction. So for example, the government can say that because of affordability concerns, the price of a certain good should not be higher than this particular price. So in that case, if the suppliers cannot really supply at the market equilibrium price, it would mean that it will result in an underproduction. Quantity regulations, once again, can also reduce the production of a certain good. For example, like tobacco products. So sometimes governments regulate those markets by putting quantity regulations that you cannot produce more than a certain quantity of that tobacco product. So when that happens, because of those quantity regulations, there is less incentive to produce at the efficient level, which leads to underproduction. Taxes and subsidies. Taxes increase the prices paid by buyers and lowers the prices received by sellers. So in essence, it will not take us to the efficient outcome, leading to underproduction. Subsidies, on the other hand, are kind of reverse taxes, meaning so producers are getting extra money from the government if they produce. So it actually increases the incentive to produce in the market or supply in the market, which leads to overproduction. So we are producing more than what the market actually deems is efficient. Externalities. Now take the example of pollution, right? So pollution is an externality of production. So if pollution is not taken into account, or the cost of pollution is not taken into account when production is happening, it basically means that you are thinking that the cost is actually lower than what it actually is. So it leads to overproduction. So for example, an electric utility creates an external cost by burning coal to produce electricity, and that burning of coal can cause acid rain. So if that utility does not account for that particular cost, that externality which is being generated by while the production of electricity is happening, then it would mean that they're thinking that the actual cost is lower, which means that overproduction will result. Similarly, an apartment owner would provide an external benefit if she installed a smoke detector, but she doesn't consider her neighbor's marginal benefit and decides not to install the smoke detector. So if the apartment owner actually also considered the marginal benefit which would be generated for the neighboring apartments, maybe the incentive to install the smoke detector would have been higher. But since that marginal benefit is harder to calculate, that results in underproduction. Public goods and common resources also result in over or underproduction. So any sort of public good, so take the example of a public park. So it is in everyone's self-interest to avoid paying for a public good like a public library or a public park, but everyone wants to use it. So since no one is really actually willing to pay for that service or that good, that actually leads to underproduction of public goods. And that is called the free rider problem. We'll get into more detail about this problem in one of the later chapters, hopefully. Now, another problem related to public goods is the tragedy of the commons. So think about a common resource such as the air, the clean air that we breathe in. Now, it is in everyone's self-interest to ignore the costs of their own use of a common resource that fall on others. So, for example, if we are engaged in some activity which actually reduces the quality of the air that we breathe in, for example, if we are engaged in driving an automobile, which basically adds to pollution, reducing the quality of air that we breathe in. So it is very common to actually ignore that cost of our use of automobiles and how that affects others, and that is called the tragedy of the commons, and that ignoring of the cost leads to overproduction. A monopoly is another reason why markets fail. So a monopoly is a firm that is the sole provider of a good or service. So since there's no other producer in the market, it would mean that the monopoly producer can actually charge any price that he or she wants to maximize its profit. And when it does that, we are no longer at the efficient point in the market. High transaction costs are another reasons why markets might fail. So take the example of Walmart. So Walmart is a place where different goods and services are sold, right? So it's basically they incur a transaction cost because they are arranging a marketplace for us. But that transaction cost might not be that high, and that is the reason why they are actually organizing that market in the first place. But for some markets, the transaction cost might be so high that it would be hard to actually organize a market. Now, what are the alternatives to the market? So no one method allocates resources efficiently, but supplemented by other methods, markets do an amazingly good job. So remember, we were talking about the different methods of resource allocation at the beginning of the lecture. So if you think about all of these market failures which happen, which we just covered, so for example, price and quantity regulations, taxes and subsidies, and etc., now all of these can possibly be remedied by majority rule, as shown on this slide. Now why is that the case? That is simply the case that most of these issues are taken up by politicians who actually decide what kind of economic policies should be implemented. And how do we decide on which politician should be in charge of designing and implementing those policies? We actually use the method of majority rule to select those politicians, which means that we essentially have the power of making those decisions. So a lot of these market inefficiencies can actually be remedied through the use of majority rule, right? Now the last one, high transaction cost, can actually be remedied by first come first served. So for example, once again sticking to the example of Walmart, if you go to Walmart, they don't keep stuff for anyone. It's just allocated on the basis of first come first serve. So if you are there in time when the product is available, you can buy that product, you can buy as many of that product, but if you are late and there's no product left, then you will not get the product. So there are ways of actually remedying market inefficiencies and market failures, and majority rule is one of the most important ways of actually doing that. Now, whenever we are talking about markets and efficiency, we get into this discussion about fairness, and we get into this discussion about the dichotomy between efficiency and equity. And that is what most of our political discussions revolve around. Like, is the outcome fair? Is the game actually fair or rigged? So what are the different views of fairness? So it's not fair if the rules aren't fair. So that is one view of looking at things. And it's not fair if the result isn't fair is another view of looking at things. So how are these two different? It's not fair if the rules aren't fair. What does that really mean? So this actually translates into the idea of equality of opportunity. So if everyone has the same set of opportunities, it should mean that the rules of the game are fair. So what is the responsibility of the government in this regard? So the state must enforce laws that establish and protect private property, and private property may be transferred from one person to another only by voluntary exchange. So the rules of the game are the same for everyone, which can mean, not essentially means, but can mean that the game is a fair game. So what is the other point of view? The other point of view is that it's not fair if the result isn't fair. So the fair rules approach is more consistent with allocative efficiency, but the distribution might be too unequal. So this comes to the idea of equality of outcome compared to the previous one, which was equality of opportunity. And most people recognize that there is no easy answer or principle to guide the amount of equality. Now, how do we measure equality? First of all, if someone is working 80 hours a week and someone is working 40 hours a week, I mean, if the person who is working 80 hours a week is earning way more, Is that a fair outcome or is that not a fair outcome? So all of these questions are hard to answer because these are the kind of discussions where economics gets mixed up with questions of politics and morality and becomes very hard to answer just from a purely economic lens. So the big trade-off is a trade-off between efficiency and fairness that recognizes the cost of making income transfers. So the greater the amount of income redistribution through income taxes, the greater is the inefficiency, the smaller is the economic pie. So think about this. So the higher the amount of taxes imposed in the economy, and so first of all, let's take a step back. Why are taxes being imposed in the economy? So the taxes are imposed because the government wants to redistribute some of the income because it thinks that the outcome is not really fair. So when that happens, we have already looked at the case of taxes, that taxes actually cause market failures, which means that they cause inefficiencies in the market. So because of taxes, we cannot really get to the efficient point in the market, which means that the economic pie actually gets smaller and smaller, and from that economic pie, the income is redistributed. So a lot of different questions arise because of this. I mean, are we going for equity while sacrificing efficiency? Is that good overall in the long term? So all of these different and difficult questions have to be answered by us, the society as a whole, and that's how we decide on these issues through the use of majority rule. We give politicians power to make these decisions by electing them, and then they make those decisions for us based on our voting preferences. Taking all the cost of income transfers into account, the fair distribution of the economic pie is the one that makes the poorest person as well off as possible. Now, once again, there's a whole value judgment involved in what does that really mean? How much is well off? Is that $2,000 a month? Is that $3,000 a month? Is that $6,000 a month? So once again, we have to decide on these issues as a society as a whole, and that is why voting becomes really important. So the fair results idea, to summarize this, requires a change in the results after the game is over. So for example, the game is over, we are at the efficient point, but then a tax is imposed, and because of that tax, the inefficiencies are caused, and because of that tax, income can be redistributed. So some economists might say that that itself is unfair because once again, we are not getting to the efficient outcome. So the central question on this in this chapter was, should price gouging be illegal? So price gouging is the practice of selling an essential item for a much higher price than normal and usually occurs following a natural disaster. Now, in the current situation of coronavirus, we can call that pretty much a natural disaster. So if the market price of hand soap, hand sanitizer, and toilet paper went up according to the mechanism of demand and supply, it would probably be way too high because the demand has gone up drastically. Now, if that was allowed to happen, that would have been termed price gouging, meaning the price of these essential items would have gone so up that it would have been unaffordable to a lot of people. Now, should that be legal or should that be illegal? Now, if you look at it from a purely economic lens, it should be legal because in that way we can get to the efficient outcome in the market. But if you look at it from the perspective of fairness and equity, it's probably not the most ideal outcome because if that happened, a lot of people would not really be able to afford these items, which are really of paramount importance in this climate where everyone needs these products. So the example over here is in Florida and Texas, where hurricanes happen all too often. Price gouging is illegal. So for example, after a hurricane, the demand for items such as generators and camp stoves increases. So let's look at it from in a graphical sense. So without the natural disaster, without a hurricane, This graph shows us the demand and supply for camp stoves, and everyone is happy here because everyone is at the equilibrium point. The quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, and the price is equal to $20 per camp stove. Now, if the hurricane happens, then the demand increases drastically. Now, the demand curve will actually shift to the right, which is happening in this case. When that happens, the market price can actually get up to $40 per camp stove. Now, is that an efficient outcome? That is definitely an efficient outcome because the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. But is that a fair outcome? Now, that becomes harder to answer because, for example, if the government thinks that a price of $40 will be too much to afford for an average consumer in this time of need, they can actually put in a price restriction saying that no producer should be charging a price above $20, which was the original price. Now, if that happens, what will happen? Underproduction will happen because the efficient production point, the efficient quantity supplied would be 7 units per day, but now it has been reduced to 5 units per day because of the price restriction. So because of this restriction, then underproduction will happen, and this blue triangle will be the resulting dead weight loss. So because of this dead weight loss, we are no longer at the efficient point in the market, and we will be actually losing some surplus to from the total surplus. Now, and also keep in mind that because of this underproduction, a lot of the people who would actually have got the camp stove will not actually get the camp stove because not enough are available in the market. So, we also always have to keep in mind the constant dichotomy between efficiency and equity. So if we are thinking purely in terms of efficiency, the market price of 40 actually shows efficient outcome. But if we are also worried about the people who for whom the $40 per camp stove price will not be affordable, then we are thinking more about on the lines of equity, and when we go for that, we will lose efficiency. So if we go for equity, we lose efficiency. If we go for efficiency, we lose equity in some cases. So that is the constant struggle that politicians and economists always have to think about. So leaves you with I'll just want to leave you with this question about just think about this coronavirus scare right now, and think about what might happen to the price of these essential items, and should price gouging in these kind of situations be allowed to happen or not. So think about this, struggle with yourself between arguing for efficiency and equity, and I will post the next lecture soon, and hopefully this lecture was helpful, and hope to see you guys soon next time.